The gavel had not even come down yet, and already the entire courtroom was staring at the woman walking through those doors, because nobody expected the daughter they called a nobody to be the one holding the file that could destroy an empire or save it. My name is Jasmine. 15 years ago, I was a 9-year-old girl sleeping behind a convenience store in Incheon, and the man everyone in this city calls the Ghost, the most feared crime boss in South Korea, was the one who found me. Tonight, I am the only person standing between him and total destruction. And everyone in this room is about to learn exactly who raised me to be this dangerous. Let me take you back to where this started. I don't remember my birth parents clearly. I remember fragments. Cold concrete under my back. Hunger that never fully left my stomach, no matter how many scraps I found. I remember counting days by how many meals I didn't eat, because counting made the hunger feel like something I controlled instead of something controlling me. I was born in Atlanta. My mother brought me to Korea chasing a man who left us both before I turned 6. She worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat in a country that barely acknowledged either of us existed. She died when I was 8. A heart condition nobody caught in time, because we couldn't afford the doctors who might have caught it. After she died, I was passed between distant relatives who saw me as an obligation instead of a child. Then foster placements that lasted weeks, sometimes days, before someone decided a Black American orphan was too much trouble to keep. By 9 years old, I stopped waiting for someone to want me. I ran instead. I ended up on the streets of Incheon, sleeping behind a convenience store because the owner sometimes left day-old food near the dumpster, close enough that I could grab it before the rats did. I learned to disappear in plain sight. I learned which alleys were safe and which ones weren't. I learned that in a country that already struggled to see me, being invisible was sometimes the safest thing I could be. That should have been the end of my story. A statistic, a name nobody remembered. Instead, on a freezing November night, a black car stopped outside the alley where I was hiding. I remember the sound first, tires on wet pavement, engine idling low and expensive. I remember pressing myself further into the shadows, certain this meant danger, because in my experience, expensive things and dangerous things were often the same thing. A man stepped out wearing a coat that probably cost more than every meal I had eaten in my entire life combined. His men called him Sejangnim, a term of respect for someone powerful. The streets called him something else entirely. The Ghost. A man who built one of the most powerful business empires in the country, with shadows underneath it nobody dared to speak about out loud. Men who crossed him vanished from deals. Sometimes they vanished from everything. He looked into that alley for a long time before he moved. I expected him to walk past, the way everyone else always did. Expensive men in expensive coats did not stop for children like me. Instead, he knelt down to my level, his knee touching wet pavement without hesitation, without concern for the suit underneath that coat. He asked me one question, in careful, deliberate English. Are you alone? I didn't answer. I was too afraid. My whole body was shaking, and not just from the cold. But he didn't leave. He didn't rush me. He simply took off his coat, the same coat that probably cost more than a year of rent for most families, and wrapped it around my shoulders like it was nothing. He said something that night I would never forget as long as I lived. Nobody stays alone tonight. His name was Kang Do-Yun. And that night, he took me home. I want to be clear about something, because I know what people assume when they hear a man like him took in a child. He was not a soft man. He was not gentle with the world. The empire he built was not built through kindness. But with me, from that very first night, something in him changed. He was patient in a way that confused his own men. Careful, protective in a way nobody around him understood, including, I think, himself. He didn't adopt me immediately. He told me later that he spent the first few months simply watching, making sure I wasn't a temporary impulse he would regret, making sure this wasn't a mistake that would hurt a child even further down the line. But within the year, he made it official. He gave me his name. He enrolled me in the best schools in Seoul. And when other children whispered about the Black American girl living in the Ghost's mansion, he made absolutely certain they understood exactly whose daughter I was, and exactly what disrespecting her would cost them. I grew up surrounded by wealth I never could have imagined as a child, sleeping behind a convenience store. Marble floors, private tutors, a wardrobe that could have clothed an entire orphanage. But wealth did not erase isolation. If anything, it deepened it. Children were warned to stay away from me, not because of my color specifically, though that certainly played its own quiet role in a country still learning what it meant to be multicultural. But because of my father's reputation, I was the daughter of a man everyone feared. That fear followed me into every classroom, every birthday party I was never invited to, every whispered conversation that stopped the moment I walked into a room. There was one woman in particular who made sure I never forgot where I came from. Madame Yun, the wife of my father's second-in-command, a woman who believed loyalty in that world should be measured strictly by blood and birthplace and bloodline purity. She never accepted me as a real Kang. She called me the charity case behind my back for years, a phrase that somehow always found its way back to me through servants who either pitied me or wanted to watch it hurt. I remember one specific afternoon, I was maybe 12 years old, overhearing her tell another wife that my father had lost his mind adopting a street child from another country, that empires like his were not built to be inherited by outsiders, that I would embarrass this family the moment real pressure ever tested me. I decided very young that I would not survive that world by being soft. I would survive it by becoming undeniable. I studied harder than anyone around me. I learned Korean until I spoke it more precisely than most native speakers, mastering formal speech patterns, honorifics, and legal terminology that even university-educated Koreans often struggled with. My father used to watch me study late into the night and ask why I pushed myself so hard when I could simply enjoy the comfort he had given me. I told him the truth every single time. Because one day, someone is going to try to take everything you built. And when that day comes, I want to be standing beside you, not hiding behind you. He didn't say much in response. He rarely did. Words were not his currency. But I saw something shift behind his eyes each time I said it. Pride, I think. And maybe fear too, because deep down, I believe he always knew a day like that was coming. I chose law specifically because of him, though I never told him that directly until years later. I studied international corporate law, the exact language his empire operated in, but had rarely needed to defend itself with an open court, because for most of his life, problems were solved quietly, before they ever reached a judge. I graduated at the top of my class. I took a position at one of Seoul's most respected corporate law firms, deliberately choosing not to mention my last name to colleagues, wanting to prove, first to myself and then to everyone else, that I could succeed on merit alone, without the weight of my father's reputation opening doors for me. For years, I lived two lives. By day, a rising associate handling international mergers, admired for my precision and my command of both English and Korean legal language. By night, I returned to a mansion where my father ran an empire that operated in shadows I chose not to look at too closely, because loving him meant accepting parts of him I could not fully understand or justify, only trust. 15 years after that night in the alley, everything I had prepared for arrived all at once. If this story has already pulled you in, that means you understand exactly what real loyalty looks like. And this is only the beginning. So stay with us on AfroKorean Chronicles, because what happens next in Jasmine and Kang Do-Yun's story is why this channel exists. The attack didn't come from outside the family. It came from within, which is always the most dangerous kind. My father's oldest business partner, a man named Choi Byung-chul, had spent decades quietly building leverage inside the company, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to seize full control. He was a man who smiled at every family dinner, who called my father brother in public, who had held my hand as a child and told me I was lucky to have been found by someone so generous. I trusted him for years. That trust made the betrayal cut even deeper when it finally came. When federal prosecutors opened an investigation into decades-old financial irregularities within Kang Enterprises, Choi saw the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire career. He fabricated evidence with meticulous care. He falsified records tying my father directly to financial crimes he did not commit, crimes that had actually been committed by Choi himself over 2 decades earlier. He built an entire case designed to bury my father in prison for the rest of his life, while quietly positioning himself to inherit everything. The company, the assets, the empire built from nothing by a man who once slept in alleys himself before he became who he was. Madame Yun supported the plan fully, and I believe she may have helped design parts of it herself. She saw this as her long-awaited chance to finally erase the family she believed never should have existed in the first place. Meaning me. My father was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I was still asleep when I heard the commotion downstairs, the sound of car doors, radios, boots on marble. I ran down in time to watch federal agents lead him out of our own home in handcuffs, his face calm in a way that terrified me more than if he had panicked or fought back. Calm men who built empires from nothing know how to hide fear better than anyone else in the world. He looked at me before they placed him in the car. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He said only one sentence, quiet, controlled, meant only for me. You know what to do. He was right. I did. I requested emergency leave from my firm the moment the arrest happened. My senior partner tried to stop me, warning me directly that representing my own father in a case this politically explosive, this publicly damaging, would destroy the career I had spent over a decade building from nothing. I told him the truth. My career means nothing if I let an innocent man lose everything, because I was too afraid to fight for him. I moved back into my father's mansion that same week, converting his private study into a war room. I spent the next several weeks buried in over 2 decades of financial documents, cross-referencing transactions, shell companies, wire transfers, and shipping manifests, searching desperately for the one inconsistency that would unravel Choi's entire fabricated case. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every night, I stared at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred together, terrified I would miss the one detail that could save him. And then, on a night I will never forget, I found it. A single wire transfer, 22 years old, buried under a shell company registered not to my father, but to Choi Byung-chul himself, hidden behind a name so obscure it had taken me weeks of cross-referencing offshore registries to connect it back to him. The exact financial crime he was accusing my father of committing was one he had actually orchestrated personally, decades earlier, using my father's company as cover the entire time. I remember sitting alone in that study at 4 in the morning, staring at the screen, feeling something between relief and rage. Relief that the truth existed. Rage that it had taken this long, and this much suffering, to find it. But finding the truth and proving it inside a courtroom were 2 entirely different battles. Choi's legal team was among the most respected and most ruthless in the country. Madam Yun had spent years cultivating relationships with judges and prosecutors quietly loyal to her husband's interests, favors exchanged over decades, debts owed in whispers rather than paperwork. The entire system had been slowly, carefully positioned against my father long before his arrest had ever taken place. I would need more than documents. I would need to outmaneuver a network specifically built, brick by brick, to ensure my father never walked free again. The night before the trial began, I sat across from my father in a private meeting room inside the detention facility, a thick pane of reinforced glass between us. He looked tired in a way I had never seen before, not even during the hardest years of building his empire. 15 years of raising me, protecting me, building something meant to survive generations, and it was all about to collapse because of one man's greed and one woman's decades of resentment. He looked at me and said, quietly, I never wanted this life to touch you. I told him the truth I had carried inside me for years. You didn't choose this life for me. You gave me a different one. You gave me a name, an education, a father who knelt down in a freezing alley instead of walking past a child nobody else wanted. Tomorrow, I'm not fighting for an empire. I'm fighting for you. He didn't cry. Men like him rarely allowed themselves that release, even in private. But his hand trembled slightly when he pressed it against the glass, and I pressed mine against the other side to meet it. He said, then let's show them exactly what that little girl in the alley became. The next morning, I walked into the courtroom, and every single person in that room turned to look at me. Choi's lawyers hadn't expected me. Madam Yun certainly hadn't expected me, and I watched her face shift from confusion to alarm the moment she realized who I was and why I was there. The prosecution had built their entire case assuming my father would rely on outside counsel unfamiliar with the deepest, most complicated corners of his business history. They had not accounted for the fact that his own daughter had quietly become one of the sharpest corporate litigators in the country, and that she had spent her entire life, without even fully realizing it, preparing for exactly this moment. The trial lasted 4 brutal, exhausting days. On the first day, Choi's legal team tried to have me disqualified entirely, arguing that my relationship to the defendant made my presence in the courtroom a conflict too significant to allow. I stood before the judge myself and argued my own right to remain, citing precedent after precedent, my voice steady even as my heart pounded harder than it ever had in any negotiation I'd handled before. The judge ruled that competence, not sentiment, would determine my place in that courtroom, and competence was something no one in that room could honestly say I lacked. On the second day, the prosecution presented Choi's fabricated evidence in full, documents that looked airtight to anyone who hadn't spent weeks tracing their origins the way I had. I watched jurors' faces grow grim as damning-looking paperwork was laid out piece by piece. I watched Madame Yun smile for the first time since the trial began, certain that victory belonged to her family now. I said nothing that day. I let them believe they had already won. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a courtroom is wait. On the third day, I called the one witness Choi never expected. A retired bank official, a quiet, unassuming man I had spent nearly 2 weeks tracking down through retirement records and old employment files, willing to testify under oath that he personally processed the 22-year-old wire transfer under direct verbal instruction from Choi Byung-chul, not my father, and that he remembered the transaction specifically because of how unusual the request had felt at the time. Choi's face went pale in front of the entire courtroom. I watched his composure crack for the very first time, watched him whisper frantically to his own attorneys, watched Madame Yun's smile disappear entirely. On the final day, I presented the complete financial trail myself. Every document, every falsified record, every inconsistency laid out with a precision that left even the prosecution quietly reconsidering their entire case. I walked the judge through 22 years of paperwork, translating complicated financial language into something even a layperson could follow, because I needed everyone in that room, not just the legal experts, to understand exactly what had happened. I turned to address the court directly, speaking in formal Korean legal terminology, so precise and so fluent that several senior attorneys in the room exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting this level of mastery from someone they had assumed was simply riding on her father's name and reputation rather than earning her place through years of discipline. I said, this case was never truly about Kang Do-Yun's crimes. It was about Choi Byung-chul's greed, hidden for 22 years behind a name that was never his to use, and behind a family that trusted him enough not to look closely until it was almost too late. The judge called for an immediate recess to review the new evidence. Within hours, an emergency warrant was issued for Choi Byung-chul's arrest, delivered live in the courtroom, in front of everyone who had gathered that morning expecting to witness my father's downfall instead. Madame Yun's face drained of all color as security escorted her husband out in handcuffs. The exact humiliation she had spent months, maybe years, preparing for my father instead landing directly and publicly on the family that had orchestrated it from the very beginning. My father was released within 48 hours. Every single charge against him was dismissed completely. His reputation, rather than remaining merely intact, was elevated in a way none of us expected, as news outlets across the country covered the story of the daughter who saved an empire her father built from nothing, using nothing but discipline, education, and a loyalty forged 15 years earlier in a freezing alley behind a convenience store. At the company's next shareholder meeting, my father stood in front of the entire board, the same board that had quietly doubted his stability and his judgment during the arrest, whispering behind closed doors about succession plans that excluded me entirely. He made an announcement nobody in that room expected. He named me Chief Legal Officer of Kang Enterprises, effective immediately. Not as a gift, not as an act of sentiment, as recognition of the woman who had just saved everything he built from total, irreversible collapse. Madame Yun resigned from her position within the family's business circle within the month that followed. Her influence, cultivated over decades of quiet favors and whispered debts, evaporated almost overnight. Her husband faced decades in prison for fraud that had gone unpunished and undiscovered for over 20 years, protected only by the trust of the very family he had betrayed. I want to tell you about the moment that mattered most to me, more than the verdict, more than the title, more than any of it. At a private dinner months later, just the two of us, no board members, no cameras, no reporters waiting outside, my father raised a glass and looked at me the way he had looked at me that very first night in the alley. Except now there was no fear in his eyes at all. Only pride, open and unguarded in a way I had rarely seen from him in 15 years. He said, 15 years ago, I found a girl nobody wanted, sitting in the cold with nothing left to lose. Tonight, I am sitting across from the only person in this world who has ever truly protected everything I built, everything I am. I told him the truth I had carried inside me for most of my life, the truth I had never fully said out loud until that exact moment. You didn't just save me that night in the alley. You gave me a reason to become someone worth saving. Everything I did in that courtroom, every late night studying law, every decision to push myself further than anyone expected, all of it started with a man who knelt down in the freezing cold instead of walking past a child nobody else wanted. He didn't say anything else that night. He didn't need to. Some silences say more than any words ever could. The company recovered fully within the year, stronger than before, its foundation now protected by legal safeguards I designed myself, ensuring no single partner could ever again quietly position themselves to seize control the way Choi had tried to. My father began stepping back from daily operations slowly, trusting me with responsibilities he had once guarded fiercely, watching, I think, with quiet satisfaction as the girl he pulled out of an alley became the woman capable of protecting everything he built long after he was gone. I think about that alley often. I think about how close I came to becoming a name nobody remembered, a statistic buried in a system that failed children like me every single day. I think about the specific choice one man made, on one freezing night, to kneel down instead of walking past. I used to believe that being found once meant I would always be safe. I learned, through fire, through betrayal, through years of proving myself in rooms that never wanted me there, that being found is only the beginning. Staying, fighting, becoming someone capable of protecting the very person who once protected you. That is the real inheritance. That is the real family. If this story reminded you that real family is built through loyalty, not blood, and that the people who show up for us in our darkest moments deserve everything we have to give in return, make sure you're subscribed to AfroKorean Chronicles, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment telling us which moment hit you the hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that the family you choose can become the strongest bond of all. Because sometimes, the child nobody wanted becomes the one person strong enough to save everything.